good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are right now. I'm very happy to join this discussion today, and thanks so much, Nancy, for the kind introduction. This is part of the book seminar that is dealing with Joseph Schwartzberg's Transforming the United Nations book. And as Nancy said, there are several sessions dealing with separate chapters of the book, and today we will be dealing with the chapter on a World Parliamentary Assembly. As Nancy indicated, I've been dealing with this topic for a long time, like Joe himself, but also in very practical terms as a co-founder and director of this international campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. And I've been working with Joe and Nancy also for many years. And as Nancy mentioned already also, the Workable World Trust that Joe established in 2014 is also now one of the major supporters of the campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly and also of Democracy Without Borders, which is the host organization of the campaign in Berlin. I may be talking a little bit more about this, meaning Democracy Without Borders, later in the end, but I think what I will be doing first is, of course, to try to give you an overview of this chapter number 3 in Transforming the United Nations System of Joe's book, which is dealing with the topic of a World Parliamentary Assembly. So we have an idea about Joe's proposals that he's been elaborating on in the book. And after that, I may provide some of my own comments on this, and later in the end say a little bit about what has been going on in terms of the international campaign and what important next steps might be. And then we will have a lot of space for discussion amongst ourselves, and as far as I am able to, I'm of course very happy to answer any questions you might have. And I may add also that it would have been fantastic if Joe had been able to attend himself and present this chapter in person, but well, he's not able to do so, which is very unfortunate. But please, Nancy, I think it is fair to say that we all would like you to transmit our best wishes and greetings to him when you have an opportunity to talk to him again. Right, so as Nancy indicated, Transforming the United Nations System, Joe's book was originally published in 2013 by UN University Press, and there are a couple of chapters in there that are in fact interrelated to a large degree. So I guess that at least in the discussion we may be touching on other topics as well, not necessarily only a World Parliamentary Assembly. So there are 15 chapters, and I'm saying this also for those who have not yet seen the book, which I believe might be the case. So there are 15 chapters dealing with the reform of the UN General Assembly, with the establishment of a World Parliamentary Assembly, with Security Council reform of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, dealing with establishing a credible human rights system, strengthening the global judicial system, better system-wide coordination, engaging civil society for civil society coordination groups, improved funding for the UN system, effective peacekeeping, and finally, it deals with a new architecture of global governance. I think it's just good that we have an idea that, you know, this book is really dealing with the whole system and has an overarching approach. And this is, in fact, I believe, important in terms of the World Parliamentary Assembly proposal, because it certainly is not an end in itself, but the reason why Joe, I believe, and me too, why we promote this body is because we think it will be a key element in a broader architecture that will allow the UN or a successor organization to deal more effectively and with more legitimacy with the global challenges of our time. Well, the book, as Nancy has mentioned, was translated, I think, into 8 languages by now, and the German edition was translated by myself. So there's proof, there's proof that I actually read it in detail. And well, I'm kidding, but the UN Association of Germany has established a working group on UN reform last month. And it may be noteworthy to say that this working group is using transforming the United Nations system, namely the German edition, as a starting point of its discussions. And I hope that there will be good recommendations coming from this working group. Actually, the goal is that the UNA Germany's recommendations will be taken up by other German NGOs. So my vision is that at the beginning of 2020, there will be recommendations on the UN reform coming out of German civil society based on Joe's book, right? I mean, I can't tell, of course, at this point what these recommendations will look like, but it's interesting, you know, that it's not just in this sense an academic work, but it's informing, I believe, political debates. And this is one example. The most important premise of the book, I think, is that the design of decision-making institutions, and that's a quote from Joe's book, has an important bearing on the quality and legitimacy of the decisions they make. So basically, Joe's book is focusing on an improvement of decision-making procedures and decision-making institutions within the UN core organization and the other UN entities, in order to put the UN into a position in the long run of actually adopting binding global legislation and putting it into a position of implementing decisions. The starting point, in addition to this, is in Joe's book, the democratic deficit of the United Nations. And I will need to elaborate a bit on what that means in Joe's understanding, but not only in his understanding. And I mean, I would have to mention at this point maybe that I am aware that some of our listeners today, they are experts on global governance issues and have been dealing with this for decades themselves. But then again, we may have listeners here who are not that common with the ideas in the book and the proposals. So I'm actually, you know, providing an overview, and later in the discussion, if need be, we can actually delve into technical details and other things. But at this stage, I believe it's important that we have an overview that is not based on prior knowledge, expert knowledge. Well, having said that, let me continue to present this idea of a democratic deficit of the UN. Firstly, which is probably the most important point, it's about the principle of one state, one vote. That's based on the idea in international law of, you know, the sovereign equality of states. And the result of this is, and it's an example that you will find in Joe's book too, that countries such as China and Nauru, the largest and the smallest ones on the planet, do have an equal say and seat and vote in most UN bodies, meaning that China's 1.3 billion citizens have one seat in the UN General Assembly, and Nauru's 9,300 citizens have also one seat represented through their government, which means that there is a ratio of 150,000 to 1 if we compare it to the population size. And Joe and other experts have been saying for a long time that this imbalance between member states of the UN that are so different, but at the same time formally treated in an equal way, is one of the main dysfunctions in the system of the UN, UN's decision-making. So basically, this you will find throughout Joe's book. He is trying to find a better balancing through weighted voting, so that the actual demography, population size, economic weight, and so on are better reflected in the representation and decision-making system of the UN. One other example, what that means, the current state, is that it is possible for the 129 smallest countries in the world represented in the UN, with a combined population of only 8% of world citizens, to command a 2/3 majority in the UN General Assembly and other bodies. So from a cosmopolitan point of view, where the starting point is an equal weight of every world citizen, this is certainly not a democratic state of affairs. And the situation is worse, which is the second main point when we refer to the UN's democratic deficit, when we look at how these people are actually, constituents and populations are represented at the UN, because it is exclusively a representation through diplomats appointed by the executive branches of UN member state governments, which means that opposition, minority, political opposition and minority representatives are automatically not included in the UN's representation system. And that's what Joe actually points out in chapter 3 of his book at the very beginning, that actually, the UN Charter has been adopted and proclaimed in the name of we, the peoples of the United Nations. But if you look at the Charter there, it does not provide for any instrument or means to actually represent these people beyond through their national government. So that's, to summarize, I believe, the two main points concerning the UN's democratic deficit. They have, of course, implications that I don't want to go into detail now, but that's essentially the one state, one vote principle, and then the fact that representation is only going through appointed career diplomats. Right, so this was like opening remarks concerning chapter 3. Why is it important to have a World Parliamentary Assembly from the perspective of the UN's democratic deficit? But then again, there is another perspective that comes into play, which does not necessarily connect with the principle of democracy, but with the question of governance and the UN's ability to adopt binding regulation. Because the premise here is that if the UN, which Joe thinks indeed is the case, should have the ability and power to adopt binding global legislation, then the system needs to be as legitimate and democratic as possible. So the other point here is that World Parliamentary Assembly would have to play a role in a system of global lawmaking. And insofar, Joe also quotes Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, starting from the idea that the UN system already, in certain ways, represents a system of governance. And this Article 22 then says, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. And if you look further into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you will see that it actually elaborates on what that means, namely that there need to be free and fair elections of such representatives, that actually on whom the authority of government is based. So basically, there are 3 stages that Joe explains in his chapter on the World Parliamentary Assembly, and I think this is really a good and important approach that you will have to take into account if you want to understand the proposal. And the World Parliamentary Assembly is also, this term is a synonymous term also for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. So we are basically not talking about 2 different kind of bodies and things, but it's basically the same. And in my talk, I will be referring to a World Parliamentary Assembly and the UN Parliamentary Assembly, I guess, in a synonymous way. And this procedural approach, saying that we have a first step and then successive steps towards a vision, that is also included in Joe's book. It's also a basic and fundamental concept behind the UN Parliamentary Assembly and the campaign. So what I will be doing is I will be briefly presenting to you the 3 stages that Joe has included in his book. Well, stage 1 would be a body established by the UN General Assembly according to Article 22 that has only advisory and consultative powers. Joe suggests that before that happens, there needs to be a preparatory process, of course. And he mentions that the UN should establish a high-level panel that would deal with an acceptable design of a World Parliamentary Assembly. So before we talk about a decision according to Article 22, I believe there will be preliminary processes and decisions happening at the UN, of course, to set the whole train in motion. And according to Joe, that would be an important point would be this high-level panel that would look into the designs and prepare the statutes. One thing that Joe has included in his book is that he believes that an Article 22 decision would have to be taken by a 2/3 majority. And maybe for those who are not expert with Article 22 and these things, that's a norm in the UN Charter that allows the UN General Assembly to establish subsidiary bodies as it thinks are required to fulfill its work. So there are many bodies that have been established on that basis, and the UN Parliamentary Assembly could be one of them. As I say, and that's not just a technical detail, Joe believes that a 2/3 majority is necessary because that's what the Charter says about so-called important decisions. And well, I will comment, you know, my own views later, and I hope I will not forget to come back to this 2/3 majority thing, because I believe actually that maybe a simple majority would be sufficient. But okay, so to recap, it would be an only advisory body with consultative powers established by the General Assembly, and now that's a key element for the first stage. It would be composed of members of parliament elected by the legislators of member states of the UN. And Joe suggests a formula for the apportionment of seats that establishes a compromise between population size, economic weight, and the principle of sovereign equality. I don't want to delve into the technical details of weighted voting and apportionment formulas right now, but the important takeaway here is that Joe believes that we do have to take different factors into account when it comes not only to the apportionment of seats in the World Parliamentary Assembly, but also to voting in the UN generally. And these are the 3 main factors that he suggests should be included in any formula, namely, to say it again, population size, economic weight, and the principle of sovereign equality. Well, and for stage 1, of chapter 3 for the World Parliamentary Assembly, that there would be, you know, a total of 564 seats according to his mathematic formula and approach, with 57 going to the United States, which would be roughly 10%, and 55 to China, 39 to India, 20 to Japan, and 15 to Germany. And then 114 nations, according to Joe's formula, would have only 1 seat, and still collectively they would represent 6.8% of the world's population, but that would still account for 20.2% of seats. So although Joe believes that the weight of micro states needs to be decreased in stage 1, they would still have a relatively strong position in this design of the World Parliamentary Assembly. Right, let me quickly see what, yeah. Okay, so another important element in the proposal is that seats would be assigned in proportion to the breakdown of parties within the legislatures they come from. So in larger countries, or let's say countries with 2 seats, there would be 1 seat for the ruling party and 1 for the opposition party. This is a key, really, I need to stress it again, a key element in the proposal, because the whole idea of the World Parliamentary Assembly is to improve citizen representation at the UN, and this means in specific terms that a broader political spectrum is represented. So let's say, for example, if it was only ruling parties represented in the World Parliamentary Assembly, we would de facto have a kind of duplication of a General Assembly, and that's not what the proposal is about. It's really about including opposition voices and minorities for the first time in the UN. So, and then this is connected with another basic and key element in the proposal, namely that the number of seats would be assigned by nations, but the seating of delegates would be along party lines individually. So there wouldn't be, ideally a Chinese or Indian voting bloc or even a US voting bloc, but individual delegates would freely choose which political group in the World Parliamentary Assembly they would like to be part of. So there would probably be a conservative group, a liberal group, a socialist, social democratic group, and so on. And this is another key element of the proposal, because it would allow the Parliamentary Assembly to work transnationally and to depart from geopolitical thinking and geopolitical groups like you would find them today at the UN. So that the political groups, transnational in nature, in the World Parliamentary Assembly would be able to look at solutions and regulations for global problems from a transnational perspective, and not from the perspective of what would be in the best interest of their own nation. Right, the work of the World Parliamentary Assembly would be basically handled by plenary, but importantly by committee meetings. So we are not necessarily talking about, large and very long plenary meetings, as these would be prepared by smaller, more expert committee meetings, like it is usually the case with all parliaments that exist. And I think this is an important aspect that always needs to be taken into account. Also, one thing I don't want to miss to mention is that Joe says that reform-minded national parliaments, even in the first stage, could authorize popular election of their nation's members of the World Parliamentary Assembly. So that, and this is, by the way, also a position that the UNPA campaign has taken, so that we would probably, in the mid-term, end up with an assembly with a hybrid composition, meaning that some members, most members probably still, would be coming and elected from the midst of national or regional parliaments, whereas others from progressive countries would be actually popularly elected. So we would end up with an assembly with a core group of democratically elected, directly elected members, and others surrounding them with less democratic legitimacy. And I think there's a lot of benefits having such a hybrid assembly, because we would expect that this would create a momentum for increasing popular election of the delegates. I only want to mention in brief that Joe also stresses the importance of the establishment of an independent electoral commission that would oversee all technicalities concerning you know, for example, the certification of the number of seats, or rules of fairness, electoral practices, and funding, and such things. So I will speed up my talk a little bit and come, yes, I am aware that we need to do that, I think, and come to stage 2. At this stage, Joe foresees that in conjunction with the UN General Assembly, the World Parliamentary Assembly will be gradually empowered to participate in adopting binding global legislation in important matters of global concern. So in this stage 2, the Assembly would not just be an advisory or consultative body, but it would actually, with the UNGA, the General Assembly, become part of the world legislative system. This goes along with increased democratic legitimacy. Namely, Joe says that at this stage, all members of the World Parliamentary Assembly would have to be elected by popular voting and no longer come from national parliaments. This is also coincidentally a position, again, that has been adopted by the UN Parliamentary Assembly campaign, because there's a lot of, you know, concern with a body that has limited or even, you know, doubtful democratic legitimacy that would be able to adopt binding global laws. So we believe that that's at least the current state of affairs, that there is this connection between democratic legitimacy and what power such an assembly may have, right? And this is, again, that can be found, this connection, in Joe's book in stage 2. Well, and then he suggests that large countries would be divided into electoral fields with their own party slates of candidates, and seats would be assigned a weighted vote to reflect the number of constituents in a better way. So at this stage 2, we wouldn't only have a system for the apportionment of seats that would be connected to population size, economic weight, and equality of nations, but in addition to this, those seats coming from this apportionment formula then would again be, you know, connected to a certain weighted vote that is, you know, coming from especially the population factor. But nevertheless, and I said before that I wouldn't like to go into these technical details today, but nevertheless, we would still have a system of so-called digressive proportionality, which means that small countries would have more seats per capita and more voting power per capita than larger ones. And then Joe points out that in stage 2, qualified majority voting is the key for the Parliamentary Assembly to be able to be an effective decision-making organ. He also mentions in this context that World Parliamentary Assembly might be a politically potent body for so-called people's veto vis-a-vis the Security Council and other UN bodies. So, and this is something I might have added at the very beginning also, that basically the citizen elected body is conceived of as a counterbalance to existing bodies also, like the Security Council especially. Stage 3 would be the next, which is still further in the future. Here, Joe foresees the implementation of the principle of one person, one vote, so that each seat in the World Parliamentary Assembly approximately would represent the same number of constituents. This is far in the future without Joe providing a timeline, which is reasonable not to do. But the idea is that in this hypothetical World Parliamentary Assembly with 1,000 seats, and then a world population of 10 billion people, each seat would represent around 10 million constituents. And then the key to achieve this is that there would be electoral fields across the world that in many cases, you know, would ignore today's national boundaries, because as pointed out before, countries are so different in their size demographically. It would be necessary to achieve the goal of similar sized constituencies to merge countries and to find electoral districts or fields that are transborder in nature. So this is basically the 3 stages that Joe suggests, and I think in the discussion it would be wonderful for those who read the book if they would like to, you know, provide more details or say things I forgot in my presentation, so that we have a broader and better view than what I could present. But as I promised at the beginning, I will also, if you allow, provide my own personal comments on what we find in the book in terms of proposals, and then also talk a little bit about the ongoing international campaign. So if you agree, I would still be talking like 5 or so minutes about these things, starting with my comments. I guess, I mean, for me, it's always important that we are aware that the idea of a UN Parliamentary Assembly or a World Parliament, they are not new. You know, UN Parliamentary Assembly specifically was first suggested in 1948 by the US-American lawyer Louis Sohn, when the Council of Europe was created with a treaty body, namely the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And at that time, it was argued, well, if that is possible within the Council of Europe, we can do the same at the UN. So the UNPA idea goes back to 1948, and the idea of the World Parliament goes even back specifically, really, in express terms, to the time of the French Revolution. So it's really more than 200 years old. And in the last 200 years and longer, there's been a growing, you know, pile and mountain of literature that's been dealing with the World Parliament idea. And if you allow, I may mention this at this point in the book that Nancy mentioned before, a World Parliament that was published by me and Jo Leinen just in April. Here it is again. In this book, the first chapter on 120 pages really digs into the historical details, and we made a lot of effort to find all relevant literature and voices speaking out for World Parliament since the French Revolution. And you will be surprised what we could find out and what you can find in the book. And many, surprisingly, many of the discussions we still have today, like how to deal with undemocratic countries, or at that time monarchies. These are by no means new discussions. We can find literature, extensive literature about it already in the 19th century. So that was for me a big surprise, and I think we can profit and benefit in big ways if we look at what has been discussed so far. So you know, I think we don't need to do everything from scratch. Stage 1 that Joe suggests in transforming the UN system is a common approach, like it is also endorsed by the Campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly, with one major difference, nevertheless. And the difference is that I believe the idea of weighted voting, or rather a formula that includes economic weight, population size, and sovereign equality, is something that is pretty unique at this stage, right, of a World Parliamentary Assembly, at least in practical terms. As I mentioned, there's a lot of literature, and even in the 19th century, there was talk about including economic weight in some formulas. But in political reality, I believe this is quite unique, and nevertheless, what has been agreed on in the Campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly is that the seats in the UN Parliamentary Assembly should actually be allocated based on the principle of digressive proportionality. Again, it means that smaller countries would have more seats per capita than larger ones. And an important example to draw on is the European Parliament, where the system is just like that. Then one important point included in Joe's book is that he believes a World Parliamentary Assembly should be open to all countries, irrespective of government type. This is something I strongly agree with also, and this has been a contentious issue since the 19th century, how to deal with monarchies at that time and today undemocratic countries. And this is something we may like to discuss later, but from my point of view, the whole issue begins with how to say what's a democratic country and what's not. So the whole definition of what is a democracy and what's not a democracy is highly problematic. So if we say only democratic countries should be represented, we are opening a box of, a box that we may not close again, and then again, who decides whether this is the case or not, that a particular country is a democracy or not? I think that is just something we don't want to establish as a, measurement when we talk about UNPA. So the idea is all countries should be able to participate, all UN member states. And, the problem is kind of solved with this premise that as powers grow of the Parliamentary Assembly, its democratic legitimacy has to grow as well. So as long as it's only an advisory body, it is argued that if there are some delegates coming from, undemocratic countries, whatever that is, it's still an advisory body. And once it is, directly elected through free and fair elections, then only we are in a position to say, all right, we are at a stage where the powers can actually be increased in a big way. Just a few more points, if you allow. There are also other methods for the establishment in international law. It's not only this Article 22, but there are strong voices who advocate that it could be created on the basis of an international treaty, or even based on a charter review process according to Article 109 of the charter. All of this, I think, implicates certain issues and problems. No way is really a perfect way, but in my assessment, in my personal assessment really, Article 22 is still the best way we can go, because if we choose an international treaty, the question remains, how do we connect this body with the actual processes and decision-making mechanisms at the UN, right? Because if it's an independent treaty organization, there is no such connection. It would have just a symbolic importance. And so to establish this connection, there would have to be a treaty, again, an intergovernmental treaty between the UN and this new assembly that points out what rights and functions the assembly would have inside the UN. And here, this is again a decision by the General Assembly. So we can cut out this whole step of an international treaty at this stage and begin with a General Assembly resolution in the first place. Having said that, in the book by Jo Leinen and me, you will find in the last part that we do advocate an international treaty to establish a UN Parliamentary Assembly. But this is in a later stage when it is necessary to create also connections to such institutions that are not part of the system today, like the international financial institutions or the World Trade Organization, because then we do need a treaty, or we have to change the treaties the World Trade Organization is based on and the other institutions to give this assembly a function, an institutional function. There are still a few important points I need to, I think, cover, and but I will really be quick. There are, I think, a couple of supporting trends for our work. I mean, we are all aware about the general political situation today we are in. So generally, I would say that in the past 5 years or so, especially in the last 2 years, the situation has become more problematic in terms of the general political environment, but at the same time, you know, paradoxically, just because of this, it seems that there is now more open-mindedness amongst some actors out there concerning the UN Parliamentary Assembly project. And I believe it has to do with the fact that they see that multilateralism and the UN are really under threat, and that they need to do something to increase the UN's connection with the world citizens, its popular, you know, perception, and really its overall legitimacy. And I mean, I don't want to say too much in terms of expectations, but I can sense that there is kind of, at least in progressive quarters, there's a kind of shift going on. That's not too much to say. So one of these trends is certainly the proliferation of international parliamentary institutions since the end of the Cold War. An international parliamentary institution, that's a body that is composed of elected representatives, and like national parliamentarians, but the European Parliament is also an international parliamentary institution, or the Pan-African Parliament, you know, which is a body of the African Union. So a study that was carried out by one of my colleagues in 2011 at that time, you know, for 1990, she counted 40 international parliamentary institutions, and 20 years later, when she wrote the study, she counted 140 of these institutions. So you know, some of you might have heard about the Inter-Parliamentary Union, which is the umbrella organization of national parliaments worldwide, and it's one of the oldest international organizations. It was created in 1889, and for a long time, it was said that, you know, the parliamentary dimension at the UN, that's taken care of by the IPU. But the situation, that's really an important point we can make now, is that there are so many international parliamentary institutions, and it needs to be justified now why it should be exclusively the Inter-Parliamentary Union that is managing the UN's connection with parliamentarians and national parliaments specifically. So this is the one trend, and let me quickly look at my notes. Right, and the other trend certainly is that we have this whole discussion going on about the Sustainable Development Goals. And here, you know, it is important that there is parliamentary oversight, and you know, parliaments are also, and parliamentarians are needed for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So here, you know, we can connect our program or project or proposal with this ongoing, you know, SDG process. And it's not only that we would need oversight and implementation through parliaments, but also SDGs, SDG 16, specifically 16.6 and 16.7 say that there should be effective, and I'm quoting, effective, accountable and transparent institutions at all levels. And then another quote, there should be responsive, inclusive, participative, and representative decision-making at all levels. And I'm emphasizing at all levels because it implies, you know, Sustainable Development Goal 16 implies that there should be transparent and representative decision-making at all levels, including the global one then, right? So this is something we really can connect with, so to promote a parliamentary body at the UN. If you allow, Nancy, just a few minutes more about the campaign, right? Okay, so you know, the campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly was created in 2007, and we did not start from scratch, but from the beginning the idea was that what we want to do is to bring together all proponents of the World Parliamentary Body based on a common platform, because There was support for UNPA out there for a long time, from different kind of actors, from different corners of the world and different institutions, but it was never, you know, coordinated, or there was never one platform that gave all this real leverage or even visibility. And this is what we want to do with the international campaign, that we actually build you know, a common voice around this idea. And by now, over 1,500 current and former members of parliament from over 120 countries in the world have endorsed the international appeal for UN Parliamentary Assembly. This appeal is probably the most important policy document because it captures what the supporters of the campaign endorse as a common denominator. And that's also how my work is informed in political terms as the campaign's director, because of course what we promote is the campaign's platform and not whatever comes to our mind. So there have been several international meetings on the UN Parliamentary Assembly in New York and Buenos Aires and Brussels and Geneva at the UN. The last one was in 2013 in the European Parliament. And I believe as we are approaching 2020, the 75th anniversary of the UN, we should seriously look into the possibility of having another international meeting on the UN Parliamentary Assembly next year or in 2020. An occasion really to augment and our efforts and to achieve big visibility, hopefully. Really just a few minutes more, if you allow. The goal of the campaign is to promote an intergovernmental preparatory process for UNPA, and you know, a couple of actors have endorsed this, like the Foreign Minister of Malta in November 2013, Federica Mogherini, when she was an Italian deputy. She is now the European Union's High Representative on Foreign Affairs, endorsed it. The UN independent expert for the promotion of an equitable and democratic international order endorsed this. In May 2017, we organized an information meeting in New York for UN missions, and for the first time I am aware of, ever actually, since the peace conference of Versailles after the First World War, this was a meeting where we had a dozen government representatives who were listening to us and, you know, to proponents of the World Parliament, and who were actually considering the matter. So this was a milestone that we will be building on. It was hosted by the Canadian mission at the UN, also a big milestone that we had this endorsement. And yesterday, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Ireland said that with regard, you know, that, let me quote it, that's better. In this regard, I have noted proposals for the establishment of a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, and Ireland remains open-minded on the concept of such an assembly. So positions such as this is what we try to achieve, and this came, he came forward with this because of a parliamentary question that was put forward by one of our allies in the Irish Parliament. And this is really totally fresh from yesterday, something we will promote in, you know, in the coming weeks. Then just really 3 more points I would like to share with you. You know, the European Parliament was the first parliamentary body we are aware of that endorsed the UN Parliamentary Assembly project, and that was in 1994, yes? So, and in 2011, and there were more resolutions of this kind, the European Parliament reiterated its support, and we are again this year working with parliamentarians and the Foreign Affairs Commission of the European Parliament with the goal that it will reiterate its support in a plenary resolution coming forward in September on UN policy. And, you know, in the European Parliament, we also, it's not like it's, you know, it's automatically approved. There is a lot of skepticism there as well. And we are optimistic, however, that this time we will manage to get a strong language coming from the European Parliament on this idea. Then finally, you know, in terms of what can you do or what can we do to support the campaign, one thing is, of course, you know, to talk to representatives, elected representatives, legislators, but also it is very useful just to do simple, simple events. For example, in the context of the Global Week of Action for World Parliament, that's been launched like a couple of years ago as a means for, as a grassroots approach. I mean, like me, you can simply take a picture with yourself saying, World Parliament Now, which is the week slogan, and put it on social media. That's certainly better than nothing, right? So this year's Week of Action will be from October 19 to 28. And finally, I see a potential for us to connect the project of UN Parliamentary Assembly with the UN 2020 effort, which means that there are civil society organizations, including the Workable World Trust, that has been a major supporter of this, that promote an open and inclusive preparatory process for a reform summit in 2020. And this is, I promise, really the last point. Another new element in our work is the idea of a UN Parliamentary Network, which would be, again, something different from a UN parliamentary insofar as that it wouldn't be a fully fledged assembly necessarily composed by all, delegates from all UN member states, but as a network, it would be open for participation by individual MPs, who are just interested in being part of this. And this was a recommendation coming from the report of the Commission on Global Security, Justice and Governance, co-chaired by former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and former Nigerian Foreign Minister Ibrahim Gambari. And I believe that this network idea is really something we need to pursue, because although the Commission, and I agree with that, says that also such a network should be recognized by the UN, according to Article 22, it would not be this fully fledged, assembly which foreign diplomats are afraid of to be open, okay? So the idea of a network is really something that also, appealed to people, I believe, at this information meeting we had in May. Right, okay, I promise to finish here, and thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.